8 men drove north into the Ottawa National Forest in October of 1937, expecting nothing more than cold air and deer season. Something was already waiting for them in those woods. Only 6 of them drove back out. My name is Roland Gast. I was born in 1908 in Sheboygan, Michigan, and I spent the first 30 years of my life believing that the North Woods were simply the North Woods, dense and cold and full of deer and black bear and nothing more remarkable than that. I was wrong about that. I know now that I was wrong, and I have spent the better part of 50 years trying to decide whether to say so out loud to anyone who would listen. I am 81 years old this coming December. I do not have the luxury of waiting any longer to tell this story correctly. The men I went into those woods with were not strangers. We were a hunting party that had been going out together for the better part of a decade by that point. There was Walt Pruitt, who ran a hardware store on Main Street and had shoulders like a draft horse. There was Carl Menger, who had come up from downstate in the 20s and never left because he said the fishing was too good to abandon. There was Pete Haller, youngest of us at 22, just married that spring and already talking about how he was going to bag a 12-point buck to hang above the fireplace in the house he and his wife had just moved into. There was Otis Drummond, who had fought in the Great War and come back quieter than he left, a man who could sit by a fire for 3 hours without saying a word and not seem uncomfortable about it. There was Frank Yoder and his brother Benny, who always hunted together and always argued about everything and somehow made the nights around camp feel warmer just by the noise of their disagreements. There was Dale Richter, who was the oldest of us at 53 and who knew the Ottawa better than any of us, having grown up on the eastern edge of it and having hunted it every season since he was old enough to carry a rifle. And then there was me. We left Sheboygan on the morning of October the 14th. The sky was that particular shade of gray that northern Michigan gets in mid-autumn, not quite threatening rain, but not promising sun either. Just a flat, pale light that sat over everything and made the color of the dying leaves look more vivid by contrast. The trees along M33 were going gold and rust and a deep burgundy red. And I remember thinking as we drove that it was one of the more beautiful drives I had ever made up into that country. The air when we stepped out of the trucks at the trailhead smelled of pine resin and wet earth and the faint sweetness of decaying leaves, and it was cold enough that our breath made small clouds in front of our faces as we unloaded the gear. Dale knew a spot. He always knew a spot. He had been talking about this particular area since the previous spring, a stretch of bottomland along the Black River that he had scouted in June and found absolutely covered in deer sign. Old rubs on the birch trees, scrapes in the soft ground along the riverbank, tracks coming down to water in numbers that made him think the herd in that area was as healthy as he had seen it in 20 years. The plan was to hike in roughly 4 miles, set up a base camp in a small clearing Dale knew about, and then hunt from there for 5 or 6 days before heading back. We made good time on the hike in. The trail was an old logging road that had been reclaimed by the forest decades earlier, but still offered clearer passage than pushing through the undergrowth, and with 8 men sharing the load of the camp gear, it was manageable work. The forest thickened as we moved away from the road, the spruce and hemlock crowding closer together, the canopy overhead dense enough that the gray sky was visible only in narrow strips between the branches. The undergrowth down low was a tangle of bracken fern and blueberry brush and fallen deadfall, and in the wetter patches near the river the ground was soft and dark and held our boot prints clearly. We reached the clearing by early afternoon, and it was a good spot, about 50 feet across, opening up on a low rise above the river with a good view down through the trees to the water. The ground was carpeted in brown needles and dry leaves, and there was a natural windbreak on the north side where a line of spruce grew tight together. Dale had been right about the deer sign. Even before we had the tents up, we could see rubs on the trees at the edge of the clearing, and Pete found a scrape not 40 feet from where we set the cook fire that was fresh enough to still smell of musk. The boys were in high spirits. Walt and Frank got a fire going. Benny broke out the coffee pot. Otis sat on a stump and cleaned his rifle without being asked. It felt like every deer camp I had ever been part of. It felt ordinary. I want to be clear about that. And on the first afternoon, there was nothing unusual about that clearing or those woods at all. We ate well that first night. Benny had brought a Dutch oven and made a venison stew from some meat they had put up the previous season, and we ate it with bread that had gone a little dry on the trail, and it tasted better than anything that had any right to. The fire was good, and the coffee was hot, and the temperature dropped into the 30s after dark. But the wind stayed still, and we sat around that fire until after 10 o'clock before turning in. Dale pointed out the stars through the gap in the canopy overhead and named a few of them. Pete talked about his wife and what she was probably having for supper and seemed both proud and a little homesick at the same time. Otis said nothing, but he was smiling faintly, which for Otis was the same as any other man laughing out loud. I remember lying in my sleeping bag that night listening to the river below the camp and thinking that I was exactly where I wanted to be. The first morning was good hunting. Walt and I took a stand along a game trail about half a mile southeast of camp and sat quiet until 8 o'clock, when a young 4-point buck came through the brush with its nose down, and Walt took him cleanly at about 60 yards. It was a good clean shot and a good clean deer, and we dressed him out right there and got him back to camp by mid-morning. Dale and Frank had seen a larger buck moving through a thick stand of hemlock to the north and wanted to go back after him in the afternoon. Pete and Benny went south along the river. Otis sat his stand alone, the way he always did, stuck in a hollow cedar halfway between camp and the water. That afternoon, the deer sign shifted. I do not mean that in any dramatic way. I mean it practically. When Pete and Benny came back in late afternoon, they said the river bottom to the south, which had been absolutely covered in tracks that morning, was quiet by afternoon. Not just quiet, empty. The tracks that had been there in the morning were there still, pressed into the wet ground, but no new ones had been added. No movement, no sound. The birds had gone quiet too, they said, not the ordinary quiet of late afternoon when the wind drops and things settle. Something more complete than that. Pete said it felt like the woods had taken a breath and held it and not let go. We did not think much of it that first evening. Deer move unpredictably. Weather changes their patterns, and an unfamiliar scent carried on a shifting wind can push a herd out of an area for a day or two. Dale had seen it happen before and said so, and we all agreed and ate our supper and went to sleep. The second morning, I was up before first light. I'd been sleeping lightly, the way you sometimes do in a new camp when your body has not fully adjusted to the sounds of an unfamiliar woods. I got the fire going and put coffee on and stood at the edge of the clearing, looking out through the trees while the sky lightened from black to a deep blue-gray. The forest in those early minutes before full dawn is a particular kind of still, not silent exactly. The river made its noise below. A raven called once from somewhere to the northwest. But there is a quality to those minutes that is different from the silence of deep night, and a kind of held readiness. And I stood in it and felt good, and did not feel anything wrong. Otis was up next. He came out of his tent, rolling his sleeves down against the cold, and stood beside me at the fire, without speaking for a few minutes, the way Otis always did. Then he said, without looking at me, that he had heard something in the night. I asked him what. He said he was not sure. He said it had come from the northwest, maybe 200 or 300 yards out, and it had woken him at roughly 2 in the morning. He said it was a sound like nothing he could place, not a coyote, not a bear moving through brush. He said it was rhythmic and low, and had gone on for perhaps 30 seconds before stopping completely. And I asked if he thought it was human, and he looked at me the way Otis sometimes did when he thought a question was not worth the words it took to ask it. Then he said no. We did not mention it to the others over breakfast. I do not know why. It seemed like the kind of thing that lost its weight in the daylight, the kind of night sound that becomes nothing in the morning. We ate and split up for our stands, and I did not think about it again until later that second day. Dale found the first tracks. He was pushing through a dense section of hemlock about a quarter-mile north of camp, trying to work around to where he and Frank had seen the large buck the day before, when he came across a section of soft ground at the base of a low-rise where the soil was black and wet from an underground seep. When he called Frank over, and the two of them spent some time looking at what they found there. When they came back to camp that afternoon, Dale was quieter than usual, and Dale was already a quiet man. He showed us after supper. He had pressed a piece of tracing paper over one of the prints and copied the outline. The print was roughly 18 inches from heel to toe. The shape was not a bear print. It was not any animal print Dale could identify with confidence, and Dale had been looking at animal tracks in those woods for 40 years. It was broadly humanoid in outline, with 5 distinct toes, but the toe spread was wide and the depth of the impression in the soft soil was significant. Dale estimated the weight of whatever had made it at somewhere between 400 and 600 pounds. The stride length between prints, he said, Ange was somewhere around 5 feet. Whatever had made those tracks had been walking upright, not shuffling, not moving on all fours the way a bear sometimes does on soft ground. Walking upright, steadily, with a long, confident stride. No one spoke for a while after Dale finished. The fire popped and shifted. Pete stared at the tracing paper in the firelight with an expression I had not seen on him before. Walt asked if it could have been a bear, walking on its hind legs. Dale said a bear could do that for short distances, but the stride pattern was wrong, and the print shape was wrong. Benny said maybe it was a big man. Otis said he had not seen another vehicle at the trailhead, and the nearest settlement was 12 miles south. Frank said we were making something out of nothing and suggested we go to bed. We did go to bed. But I noticed that Frank kept his rifle inside his tent that night instead of propped against the spruce tree outside the way he usually did. The second night, the sounds came again. This time, everyone heard them. I was awake at roughly 1 in the morning, not from any particular reason, just the light sleep of a man getting older when I heard it for the first time. It came from the northwest, the same direction Otis had mentioned, but closer now. It was a low sound, difficult to describe to anyone who has not heard it. Not a howl in the way a wolf howls, not a grunt in the way a bear makes. It was somewhere between the two, and also unlike either of them, a deep, resonant vocalization that seemed to carry more weight than it should have, more physical presence than a sound ought to have. It lasted for perhaps 20 seconds and then stopped. Then after a pause of maybe 2 minutes, it came again, this time from a slightly different direction, more northerly, as if whatever was making it was moving. I heard Walt shift in his tent. I heard Otis sit up. Through the thin canvas wall of my tent, I could hear Pete's breathing change from the slow rhythm of sleep to the shallow quiet of someone lying completely still and listening hard. The sound came a third time, closer. Dale's voice came low and steady from inside his tent. He said everyone should stay where they were and keep quiet and not put any light on. He said this in the tone of a man who has made decisions in difficult situations before, not panicked, not alarmed, simply clear. We did what he said. We stayed still and quiet and listened. Whatever was making that sound circled the camp over the next hour. I know that is how long it was because I was watching the luminous dial on my wristwatch, which I had been given as a present by my father the year before and which I have kept to this day. From 1 o'clock until 2 o'clock, something moved around the perimeter of our camp in the dark. Sometimes the sound it made was vocal, that low carrying resonance. Sometimes it was movement sound, the soft compression of pine needles underfoot, the occasional tick of a low branch being displaced. It moved slowly and steadily, and it did not seem disturbed by our presence. It seemed, if anything, deliberate. At 10 minutes past 2, it stopped. We waited for another 30 minutes before Dale said it seemed to be done. Nobody slept after that. In the morning, we found more tracks at the edge of the clearing. They came from the northwest, along the same general line Dale's tracks from the day before had suggested, and they circled the camp at a distance of roughly 40 feet from the outermost tent before going back into the trees on the east side. The stride was the same long, upright stride as before. The depth of the impression suggested something very heavy moving with purpose. In one spot, at the northeast corner of the clearing where the ground was softest, we found a place where whatever it was had stopped and stood for some time. The soil there was compressed deeply, twice over, as if it had shifted its weight from one foot to the other repeatedly, as if it had stood there for a while, looking at the camp, looking at us while we slept. Dale called a meeting. He laid it out plain. We had something large in the area that was upright walking, heavy and apparently comfortable moving around human camps at night. He said he did not know what it was. He said he was not interested in speculating about what it was. He said the practical question was what we were going to do about it. Walt said we should set a watch. Benny said we should pack up and leave. Pete did not say anything, but I saw the way he was looking at the tree line and I understood what he was thinking. Otis said he thought we should stay, but that we should be armed at all times and should not go anywhere alone. Frank seconded that. Dale agreed. We agreed to stay one more night and to keep 2 men on watch in 4-hour shifts and to see what happened. The third day, nobody bagged anything. The deer were gone, and not just less active or spooked into the deeper brush. Gone. The game trails we had been using showed no fresh sign. The river bottom to the south, where Pete and Benny had seen tracks 2 mornings ago, was still empty. Even the ravens that had been calling in the mornings were not calling. The forest had that hell-breath quality that Pete had described, only now all of us could feel it, and none of us were inclined to dismiss it as imagination. I was on first watch that night with Carl Menger. Carl had been quieter than the others throughout the day, not the way Otis was quiet, which was temperamental and comfortable, but the way a man is quiet when he is working something over in his mind and not arriving anywhere satisfying. He told me on watch that when he had been fishing the upper reaches of the Black River the previous spring, he had spoken with a trapper named Elias Brandt, who worked that country and who had told him something he had not thought about until now. Brandt had said the Ojibwe people who had known that particular stretch of forest for centuries had a name for something that lived in the deep timber north of the river, something they had been encountering for as long as anyone could remember. Brandt had said he himself had seen tracks on 3 separate occasions over 20 years of trapping that country, and that he had learned to give them a wide berth and to move on when he found them. Carl said he wished he had paid more attention to that conversation in the spring. We sat in the cold and watched the tree line and kept the fire low. And at midnight, Walt and Otis relieved us, and Carl and I went to our tents. I was nearly asleep when I heard the dog. I should say that Dale had brought his hunting dog, a 5-year-old black lab named Rook, who was a good pheasant dog, and who Dale took everywhere. Rook had been sleeping under Dale's cot in the tent, the way he always did on hunting trips. I heard Rook begin to whimper at roughly 1 in the morning, and then the whimper became something more sustained and distressed, a low, continuous sound that a dog makes not when it has been startled, but when it is genuinely afraid. Then I heard Walt's voice, low and urgent, from outside. Then Otis, saying something I could not make out. I pulled on my boots and took my rifle and came out of the tent. Walt was standing at the north edge of the clearing with his rifle raised and his light off. Otis was 3 steps behind him with his rifle at his shoulder. Both of them were looking at the tree line to the north. I came up beside Walt and looked where he was looking. There were 2 points of reflected light at the edge of the trees. Eye shine. Roughly 7.5 feet off the ground. Not the reddish eye shine of a deer or the green of a raccoon. A pale yellowish reflection, steady, not blinking, and widely set. The 2 points of light were perhaps 6 inches apart. Whatever they belonged to was standing at the edge of the tree line and looking at us and making no effort to conceal that it was doing so. Rook was now making a sound I had never heard a dog make and hoped never to hear again. Not barking, not growling, and a low flat sound of pure animal terror. The lights did not move for what felt like a very long time. I was aware of my own heartbeat in a way I had not been since the war. Walt had not lowered his rifle. I could see his forearms were rigid. Otis was breathing steadily through his nose the way he did when he was making himself stay calm. Then whatever was standing in the trees moved, not quickly. It shifted to the left with a deliberate, unhurried movement, and for just a moment, as it passed behind a gap in the tree line where the sky was visible, it was silhouetted against the lesser darkness of the overcast sky above the canopy. The shape of it was unmistakable. It was upright, broad-shouldered. The head was large, and the posture was not human, but the overall form was bipedal and large in a way that was deeply wrong against that tree line. And then it was gone, behind the trees, and the eye shine was gone, and there was nothing. Walt lowered his rifle slowly. He looked at me. He said he was not sure his legs were working properly. I told him I understood the feeling. Nobody slept after that. The morning of the fourth day was a council of war. Dale was direct. He said he was not a man given to fear, and he was not going to pretend that he had not been afraid the previous night, and that seemed to release something in the rest of us, because one by one around that fire the men admitted to themselves and to each other that what we were dealing with was not something any of us were equipped to handle, and that continuing to stay in those woods was an act of foolishness and not of courage. Pete said he had a wife at home, and Benny and Frank looked at each other in the way brothers do when they have already said something to each other privately that they are only now saying out loud. Otis said he had faced a great many things in his life that frightened him, and that this was not like those things, and that the difference he felt was not cowardice, but recognition. Carl said nothing. Carl had not said much since the night watch. We decided to pack out that day and come back with the trucks. We had barely started to break down the camp when it came back. It was mid-morning. The light was thin and gray, and the temperature had dropped overnight, and there was a smell in the air like iron and pine sap, and something else I could not identify, something animal and old. Walt and I were rolling the tent canvas when we heard the sound from the northwest again, but not at the perimeter distance, much closer, perhaps 100 feet into the trees. Then we heard something hit the ground, a heavy impact, like a large object dropped from height, and then silence. Dale told us to move faster. We moved faster. We left the tent stakes. We left the Dutch oven. We left 2 of the folding camp chairs that were not worth the time to collapse and strap. We loaded the essential gear on our backs, and Dale took Rook on his lead, and we started down the old logging road toward the trailhead. We'd gone perhaps 200 yards when it followed us. I'm not speaking metaphorically. Something large came into the trees parallel to our line of travel and kept pace with us. We could hear it moving through the brush to our left, not closing the distance, not retreating, simply following at a steady 40 or 50 feet off the trail, unhurried, as if it was escorting us out of its territory. Every few minutes it would make that sound, that low resonant vocalization, and every time it did, Rook strained at his lead and tried to climb up Dale's leg. We did not stop walking. We did not run, because Dale told us not to run, and Dale was right. You do not run from a predator unless you are prepared for it to commit to the pursuit, and none of us wanted to test what a commitment from this thing would look like. It followed us for a mile. Then it stopped. The moment it stopped following us was as distinct and clear as when it had started. The sounds of movement through the brush to our left simply ceased, the way a clock stops when its spring runs out, and in the absence of it was so complete that for a moment none of us were sure it had actually happened. We kept walking for another 100 yards before anyone said anything. Then Walt said he thought it had stopped, and Dale said yes, and we kept walking. We reached the trailhead and the trucks in 2 hours. We loaded everything and drove. Nobody spoke for a long time. Pete drove with both hands on the wheel and his jaw set. Frank stared out the passenger window. Otis sat in the back between me and Carl and looked at the floor. When we reached the first town south of the forest, Dale pulled over and got out and stood by the roadside for a while, looking back north. Then he got back in and said that he was never going back to that particular stretch of the Ottawa again, and that he would understand if any of us disagreed with him. Nobody disagreed. Nobody went back. I want to be precise about what I am and am not claiming. I'm not a man who believes in monsters. I spent my working life as an engineer, and I believe in evidence and measurement and the physical world. What I'm telling you is that in the autumn of 1937, I was in the Ottawa National Forest with 7 other men, and something was there with us that I cannot explain by any means available to me. I have described the tracks. I have described the sounds. I have described what Walter, Otis, and I saw standing at the edge of the tree line on that 3rd night. I am not embellishing. I am not misremembering. I'm 81 years old, and my memory of those 4 days is clearer than my memory of last Tuesday, because some things leave a mark so deep that time does not touch them. And I've spoken with enough people over the years who have had their own experiences in those particular northern woods to understand that we were not the first, and almost certainly not the last. The Ottawa is a large forest. It has been a large forest for a very long time. The thing we encountered had been there before the loggers came through, and before the settlers came through, and before any of us were born into that part of the world, and I have no doubt that it was still there the morning after we drove south. That is the thing I keep coming back to in the 50 years since. Not the fear of those 4 days, though that was real. Not the specific memory of those eyes in the tree line, though that has stayed with me every night for 50 years. What I keep coming back to is the quality of its behavior, the patience of it, the way it circled before it acted, the way it followed us out without closing the distance. It was not rabid, it was not random, it was doing something specific and intentional, and when we left it stopped. We were in its territory. That is the plainest way I know to say it. We went into a place that belonged to something older than any of us, and older than any record we have of that country, and it let us know that we were there on its terms, and when we understood that and acted accordingly, it let us go. That is the bargain those woods offered, and we were fortunate enough to accept it before the terms got worse. Not everyone who has gone into that country has been so fortunate. I know that. I have heard the other accounts over the years, the ones that did not end with everyone driving home. I think about those people, and I think about what it means to mistake patience for absence and to assume that because something has not acted, it cannot act. That is a mistake you only get to make once in country like that. The Ottawa National Forest is still there. The Black River still runs through it. The spruce and hemlock and white pine are still thick enough in the deep sections that midday looks like dusk. I do not doubt for one moment that what walked the perimeter of our camp in 1937 is still walking those woods today, or something descended from it, or something that has always been there and will always be there long after every last one of us is gone from that country. Some territories do not belong to us. Some things existed before we had names for them and will exist after we have forgotten whatever names we came up with. The wisest thing I ever did in my life was to walk out of those trees and not go back. I'm grateful for the wisdom. I'm not proud that it took so much convincing to find it.